Hello and welcome to another episode of Adventures in .NET. I'm Sean Claver, your host, and with me today, co-host Christian Wentz. Hey, Christian.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Hi, Sean.
Hey, nice to see you
Happy to be
again.
back.
Where have you been?
I was on the tarmac for the recording of the last show, and I was so looking forward to talking to my old buddy Jimmy. But I didn't leave the house today, so all good.
Where were you flying to or from?
I was flying back to Munich, and landed, but then all hell broke loose because they didn't find I think the stairs to let us disembark the plane. So anyway, I'm here. I will meet our missing co-host Adam Formanek next week in person, actually. So I'll make sure that he will not miss a show again.
Oh, good. Give him help for me.
I will.
All right. Let's welcome our guest this week, Chris Martinez. Hey, Chris.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, not a problem. So we typically like to get started with our first-time guests. Have them tell us a little bit about themselves, how they got into development, how they got into .NET. So why don't you start us there?
Oh, wow. That's the Wayback Machine. Already 88 miles per hour. Let's see. My first introduction to .NET, I was just getting into engineering circa 99, 2000, learning, I think, VB6 at the time. And a friend of mine who was in the industry, he's like, forget everything you know about it. Just go learn this thing, VB.NET, and that's going to be the future. That started me on my path to .NET. And, it's really funny. The thing that really put me over into the C# realm was the missing feature in VB. For people who don't remember, VB.NET did not have the concept of XML comments when it was first released. And that was like my bread and butter. I was like always going to the object browser and I'm going to share stuff with people and I got to see what this thing actually does and IntelliSense and all that. And it just didn't have it. So I started doing libraries in C# just for that feature. And then eventually I just came to prefer the syntax and then the other little nuances that were just a lot harder to do in VB. It's pretty rare I do VB anymore, but that was probably my intro into C#. So that was probably, 2001, 2002, right when things were coming out. And I've pretty much been doing it ever since.
It's a very similar story. Yep.
We've all been there, right? But
Yeah.
looking back is not always a good idea, right?
So you're one of those rare unicorns that actually comments your code?
Well, on the outside, when you do libraries, on the inside, you should write code that's self-describing, and you should only put a comment when the code can't actually describe it. Like the people that put comments that are like write a method called foo and put a comment that says does the foo, that just irks me.
Yeah, or like never do it this way, but I'm doing it right now. So,
right, this should never happen.
Yeah. So what kind of projects do you typically work on?
I almost think like we're this dying breed. I would say I'm still like the jack of all trades. I've touched everything from Active Directory, Exchange, web development, Windows development, UIs, you name it all. And I think now we're entering this phase of software engineering where you're starting to have very disciplined and a little bit more siloed roles. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We consider other sciences like medicine or law, right? You're an expert in AI, you're an expert in web development, you're an expert in UI development. You just can't know it all anymore. I mean, gosh, I feel like there's a new web development framework every other week. How do you keep up with that? Today, I've probably been doing services pretty much as my focus point for probably the last 15 plus years. So I've really ramped up and done everything and under the sun when it comes to services, WSDLs and SOAPs and WCF and REST, all that. And I've really made it in more recent years. I really made it a point to just know and be an expert in everything that there is to be Rust. I'm sorry, not Rust, but to be REST. I do some Rust too, but to be everything that's around REST. And it's actually fascinating to me to watch what happens in the industry and how that's really become this other buzzword. Especially when young people come, I've been building a REST API. Okay, well, what does it mean to be RESTful? And it's usually crickets. I'm like, have you actually ever read Fielding's paper? Like, how can you say you're doing something if you can't actually define it?
Yeah, that's kind of funny. That's actually one of my interview questions for junior level developers that are coming in, and please explain what RESTful development and APIs what means, and explain all the different verbs and whatever. And still, a lot of people just what do you mean? It's like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also surprising that there's this false equivalency that REST equals HTTP. It does not, right? You can be RESTful not doing HTTP. That's not what the constraints actually say. Now, it's true that's what Fielding actually did, right? He built a constraint system so that he could evolve HTTP, and that's obviously the most prolific application of it, but it's by far not limited to that. I mean, I think probably the most ubiquitous other example might have been WS transfer. If anybody remembers that old SOAP protocol, that was they'll basically had like 4 operations, which was get, patch, put, and post. Now that doesn't probably make sense if you're doing it over HTTP, but if you're doing a non-HTTP as the transport medium, like you just wanted to do raw TCP, okay, you could argue maybe you're doing REST over just raw TCP.
So how does that work? Are you not using the same verbs? And
so you do, but so HTTP has the methods that you actually use, and that in and of itself doesn't need to be part of the API. So in WS transfer, right, you had their SOAP operations, right, basically your RPC style. So you'd have a method called get, and this would be the equivalent. The get in WS transfer, let's say, would be the equivalent of the HTTP get method. Except that you're not going over HTTP, right? So if it's pure RPC, pure TCP, or maybe even some other protocol, you're effectively doing the same type of get, but it's just not using HTTP.
Okay, yeah, got it. So sounds like you've done a lot of work with APIs. I think that's kind of our subject for today. It's going to be about APIs.
Most definitely.
So one of the tricky things about APIs a lot of people run into is they'll write an API, everything's working, whatever, but then they've got to make some changes that may or may not be breaking, and they get another version of it, and lots of different approaches for that. There's a lot of gotchas with different approaches, things like that. So what have you learned through the years for versioning APIs?
Whew, a whole bunch, especially when it comes to REST and doing HTTP. I think probably the first one of the first things is the fallacy of backwards compatibility. People tend to treat an API version, and when I say API version in the context of HTTP, like it's a binary version, and it is not. It's something completely different. I mean, I think that's why, if you were to ask Fielding himself, he would say that the only type of versioning you could do would be by media type negotiation. Why? Because you're not asking for different resources, you're asking for a different representation of that resource, and that's actually the version itself. And so I've heard lots of questions about, well, can I do like semantic versioning? No, that doesn't work. That's not how binary stuff works. There's the other one I think is like, well, it's backwards compatible. You are a service. You cannot guarantee that every client in the universe that calls you does something like have a tolerant reader. Now, so a tolerant reader is something that knows how to read the response, and if it doesn't understand it, it just happily ignores it, being ergo tolerant. And we see most of modern serialization libraries, like for JSON and XML and all these other different types of formats, they tend to intrinsically be tolerant readers, but you can't guarantee that. There could be a client that reads it and goes, oh, well, if I see extra stuff in here, I fail, right? Because it's something I don't expect. I have seen stuff like that happen before. And so you can't just guarantee that you're not going to break somebody. So even if you add, people think, oh, if I just add stuff, it's just going to be totally fine. That's not necessarily true. And there's not really a way for you to verify that. If Facebook adds like another attribute to their API, there's no way they can go, well, let's just test all the clients and make sure that nobody broke. It just doesn't work that way. So the only safe way you can ever advance any kind of change is to have a new version. I mean, it's just whether it be behavioral or something you send over the wire.
But of course, it means you have to maintain old versions Well, to some extent, right? I mean,
Absolutely. I think this is probably for service teams out there that are designing APIs. I think that's probably, at least in my work experience, one of the things that I've noticed is that teams do not have a sound versioning policy. And by policy, I mean that we're only going to support N-2, right? It's just completely nonsensical that you're going to support all the versions forever. And then what is that policy? When are you going to when you say you're going to deprecate something, is it going to be alive for the next 6 months, the next year? Like, when is it going to be gone? And how do you advertise that? How do you advertise that to clients that that's actually going to happen? And I think once you do that, then you get into a slot where suddenly where you thought, oh gosh, how am I going to support 10 different versions to oh, I only ever have to actually do 3. It's maintainable. And you actually, especially if you do that up front, you have a reasonable expectation with your clients. Like, hey, I told you this thing's going to go away in 12 months. So when I finally pull the rug out from under you, there shouldn't be anybody there anymore.
I mean, quite often, at least that's what I'm seeing when working with corporations and companies, is that at least more often than not, you don't think about versioning when you do the V1. You start thinking about versioning when you see it's you can't avoid having a V2 or a V1.1, which is a different discussion, right? And then things start, right? And then maybe you have 2 versions you maintain, and then you still kind of don't care, and you can maintain both at the same time, right? But then when you have a lot of changes, or I had this recently in a project that some legal regulations changed, which required an API, a different API behavior, let's put it that way, then all hell breaks loose, right? And it's I see it so often that at least at the beginning they say, well, we have an API, and I don't know, maybe we are the only consumers of that API. These are those famous last words, right? Yeah, and that will never change. Or us being the only consumers means there's one client and we control that client, right? And as long as these preconditions are correct, that's a sound approach. But yeah, that will end.
I've definitely seen that before. Yeah, I've struggled to come up with exactly what the right terminology is for that. But I always say that even if you didn't start with versioning, you always had an initial version, whatever you called it. Even if you maybe didn't call it anything, like the initial launch, maybe we called it V1, but we don't have an actual V1 semantic. It's just that was the initial thing with the default that we launched. So that always exists, even if you don't formally have it. It's always there.
So, I mean, what do you recommend? I know every project is different, right? And there are so many factors swing in, right? But when should you start thinking about API versioning? Is it upfront? Is it after 1.0? No matter whether you call it like this or not? Is it? I mean, you can say it depends, and it's the correct answer. But I mean, are there some kind of rules you have encountered? Or?
I always think you're so it's we never want to over engineer. We never want to analysis by paralysis and all that type of stuff. So I think, again, going back to, I think that the thing that you have to really do first is define policy. You can define policy, and that sets you up for the future without necessarily doing a whole bunch of work, right? We just know we don't know, it's pretty safe to say that we don't know if we're going to have a V2 or V3. There probably will be some iteration, and so it's in our best interest to actually say what the policy for that's going to be when it happens. And that might not happen for 6 months or 3 years or possibly never, right? It's just, you just have a defined policy. And then exactly what's that strategy going to be when that time comes?
I think that's great advice. I know that lots of people say, or not lots of people, some people say, yeah, policy and yet another document no one reads. But still, then it's in writing and everyone agrees on it. And then once the time comes, well, everyone hypothetically agrees on it. But then when the time comes, right, you can say, okay, look, that's what we decided.
I mean, sort of related to that is, we say a lot of V1, V2. A lot of more mature APIs have actually moved. Azure, for example, has moved to using dates rather than version numbers. There's a couple of interesting things about that. One is you always know exactly when it released. So, you can't, who knows when V1 was released, but when you see that it's like, the 2018 API, like maybe it's a bit old.
So what's your preferred versioning mechanism then? So do you go with dates, or I don't know, the commit IDs, or major minor
I think
patch?
doing a prefix with like a slash v1 v2 seems to be the most common to me, but that doesn't mean it's the best.
Yeah, so numbers are certainly still out there, very common. One of the things I have encountered. It's sort of amusing is then people trying to map that into like their binary implementation, or trying to figure out like this thing, and then still coordinating it to a date. So I would say if I'm building an API for the public, I mean actually probably almost just general. If I'm doing anything outside of an example, I would probably use a date. And the biggest reason I like a date is that clearly exposes when this thing was actually released. Like, when was this version? As opposed to a number. I mean, numbers are simple, but you can't infer or know like when did that thing actually become available. I think that's another thing that's misunderstood, is like divorcing those two ideas, right? Like, what you see over the wire doesn't have a direct correlation to what's behind the scenes. Like, the infrastructure and improvements could have changed 10 times behind the scenes, but the actual wire protocol just didn't change. It didn't break. I mean, there's tons of other examples of this in the wild. I mean, think about like FTP or SMTP or things like these. The protocols haven't changed. I guarantee you the implementations of those things have changed, improved over the years. Even for the same versions, like, we came up with more optimized things. And so, yeah, just because you have an old, let's say, date of the wire protocol doesn't necessarily mean you're actually talking to an old service implementation.
I think another, let's say, technical aspect is where do you put the version number? I mean, there are several options, right? Path, query string, accept header, extra non-standardized header. Do you have like a preference, which is always the first one you recommend, right? Or is it again, different?
No. So I have.
I was hoping for that.
I have refined my opinion over the years. I used to be a little bit more pragmatic about it, although I've probably become more dogmatic about it. Simply because. Again, becoming more versed in what REST means and trying to align that. If you're not actually building a RESTful API, but you're doing HTTP, that's fine. They're just two different things. As long as we don't conflate those two ideas, it's fine. So I generally would probably go with the query string. That is probably not the absolute true RESTful way, but it tends to be the most pragmatic in terms of implementation, simply because there's a lot of stuff with like web apps, and you just put it in the query string. If you're running, like, let's say, the fetch API and some JavaScript in a web page, it's kind of a pain if you have to go put it in a header, or you have to go put it like in even if it's accept or some custom header.
Yeah, but I mean, you might have authentication as well, right? Where you would also need to set a header. So is that really something that turns clients off? I mean,
I don't think so. I just
okay, no,
it's pure laziness. It's convenient. I mean, I'd say one example where I'd say one practical way where it's very useful if you're building and testing is you could just put it right in the browser and see what the test results are.
Okay.
It's like super easy. So I don't really have a problem with, there's not really need to do a custom header, simply because you already have like accept or content type. That's probably where it should really go. There are a few limitations to that, but I mean, certainly doing it by content type negotiation is the true RESTful way, the best way. And there actually are a few APIs in the wild that do that. The GitHub API is a very popular example, I could say, that does it that way. So now to the most controversial part. Putting it in the path is just flat out wrong. It's just not. It is not RESTful. And I've really been trying to steer people away from that. I'm due for some blog posts that really kind of outline this. So there's several problems with that. First and foremost, like the reason it's not RESTful is you actually break the uniform interface constraint, right? The uniform part of the uniform interface is saying that the URL, right, specifically the path, is a resource identifier. So let's say if I ask for order 123, right, and then I stick a V1 in front of that or a V2 in front of that, by the semantics of REST, by the uniform interface, those have two different IDs.
Yeah, but it's the same resource. Yeah. So I
but it's the same resource, so it's actually false.
Yeah.
So there's just two problems with that. One, people think that the ID is actually 123, which is wrong. It's actually the whole path. And then the fact that you have two paths actually imply that you have two different resources, when in fact you actually don't. What you have is two different representations of the same resource. Now, the counter argument to that, because I'll counter my own argument, is you are allowed to have multiple identifiers to the same resource, but that's not really what this means. Generally, it's like, oh, you could go find this some other place or something like that. That is just the edge of it. If you're really trying to build a service taxonomy that is RESTful and you have versioning, where things really fall down in the path are things like if you want to do Hatios, right? If you want to have hypermedia to give links. So let's say that you have order 123 and then it has a link to customer 456. And these are independent services that evolve separately. So if you ask for V1 orders 123 and there is a V1 and a V2 of customer 456, how do you know which version the client wants? You don't. Like, the only way you can do that is either have to, there's several possible approaches. One, you just flat out assume this is what the client wants, which would be wrong because maybe they're not. Two, there's some other kind of coupling where you just like advance it to like the most recent one, but then you don't know that the client can actually handle that, right? Or three, which some people do, but it requires a lot of discipline. It's a headache, if you ask me, is what I would call symmetrical versioning. So if you have an entire API set and you say, well, every single one always has the same version, then in those ways it can work. But in general, like, a client should always ask for the version it wants. You should never even advertise it, because it can't be, you can't know what the client actually wants. It's the client's responsibility to ask for it. In the same way you would ask for media type, right? You don't tell the client, hey, go here and ask for JSON. You just say, go here. And the client says, hey, I'd like this in JSON. If the service supports, the client might ask for it in XML. You don't know why they might need to ask that. And you can't tell them what they need to ask for.
But I mean, sorry, I have to quickly go back to pending the version in the query string. But what do you do when you do hey to us then? You have the same issue like with path, right? Or you
just don't put it in there at all, right? But again, the query string is not part of the identifier. Okay, right? The query string is literally just that. It's part of it's query semantics, and the identifier of the resource doesn't change. Now, you could potentially, put it in the query string as a suggestion, but the client can easily not honor that. As opposed, they could just drop off the query string and say, hey, I'm going to request it with this. As opposed to, if it's in the path, now you're talking about, you have to break it apart. You have to understand like where in the path the version exists, and then like meld it back together. Yeah, it just turns into a real mess.
Yeah. Okay. No, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, even once you have hey to us, things will not automatically get better, right? Because I've seen several applications where they just take what they get back from the call and then just take those URLs verbatim, right? But then ignore sending headers or appending to the query string, right? But I absolutely support your point that where in the path is the version number? That's semantic information that we don't have, right? That's not standardized. I mean, with most APIs, it's at the same place, but still, that's not a standard, right? That's just
it's actually quite strange of like how we thought about that, because the path segment, like you have like divisions, like just, I guess, as humans, as engineers, like we just can't divorce that from our brains. Like the slash in the path really doesn't mean anything, right? Like it looks like it denotes hierarchy, but it does not, right? This is some implied intention that like we have as human beings looking at. The whole entire path could just be a GUID and it would be just as valid. It could really be just anything. And so trying to understand subparts in the constraints of REST, not a good idea.
So what kind of APIs are you usually working on? Is it all HTTP plus REST, or do you say, I don't know, gRPC is the thing, or REST it is, but I prefer, as you mentioned, TCP/IP? Is there like a strong preference or a trend
Ooh.
you're seeing?
That's a great question. I think we're down to I honestly think we're down to probably those two buckets. Like, we've basically tried just about everything, and I think those are the winners. So you're either doing HTTP REST, or you're doing gRPC with protobuf. Like, where does that actually make sense? I think that if you're trying to do reach, then HTTP with REST makes a lot more sense. You're probably going to have there's a lot more prescriptive semantics around how HTTP works, what the rules are, what you can actually expect, and adapt to it. Going with gRPC, it's not quite there yet. There are a few things. There are a few higher level protocols that have been there. I don't know if if you're not familiar with like Apache Arrow, for example, does that. They do a common Arrow is actually like 3 different things. They have like a file format, they have an API, and they actually have a wire protocol. And the wire protocol is a combination of their file format with gRPC, basically. So maybe someday we'll have more of that there. Certainly, if you're trying to do a binary transport, like, I wouldn't do anything other than gRPC.
Okay.
Just period end.
So I would like to quickly go back to versioning, because there's another aspect that I always find very interesting, because I've had some issues with that in some parts in the past. So since we are adventures in .NET, let's just assume we are exclusively using .NET to write our HTTP REST APIs, and of course we're using Web API and not, say, Nancy for that. So how do you do versioning there? Because the story of the versioning package is an unsteady one, right? So I think it was updated for version 5, and then I think didn't even the person running this within Microsoft leave, and now it's an open source project. It was resurrected for 7 or 8.
Well, you're talking to that guy.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to dig in that.
So
Yeah.
yes.
Very well aware.
I mean, like real talk. Like, I am the team.
I know.
What a setup, Christian. What a setup.
Yeah. So, what happened it was, well, I'm not going to say anything bad, but it was it turned into a real mess when I decided to leave Microsoft, and there was not a very good handoff of when that happened. And I fell on a lot of grenades. I reached out to a lot of people to try to make it right for the community. It's taken quite a while to right the ship. Most of it's all solved. I think largely for the better. The biggest challenge in that specific transition is, I started it in the open source under the Microsoft brand. Well, there's a couple of reasons for, full disclosure, there was a couple of reasons for that. One, I wanted to be, do the right thing, right? I was actually doing IP inside and taking it open source, going through the proper channel. But in addition to that, I probably did have a little bit of a minor ulterior motive. Like, if it's under the brand, maybe it'll get more attention.
And I mean, sorry for interrupting. Yes, but sorry for interrupting there. Yeah? But the official RESTful API framework of a major web framework needs to have versioning. So I wouldn't take or I wouldn't have taken a versioning library. And I mean, there were others, right? But I wouldn't have taken one that was not official, right? Because that's something that has to be baked in. Or I mean, if it's a Microsoft.star NuGet package, a semi-official, or however you would like to call this, it needs to be one of those packages, right? Because it's such an integral feature for APIs.
Yep, no, definitely. When the project first started and it finally got some attention, there were talks that with the ASP.NET team about whether or not it would. So I was never part of the team. There was some talk about they might take it over or somehow it would be integrated, and that just never happened. I'm just under the impression they were pretty happy with how I was running it. And that was all fine. But where things then sort of became confusing and not clear when I left, there was nobody else running the project. And nobody else stepped up to help out, which meant there was no way for me to actually continue maintaining the Microsoft branding, because as not a Microsoft employee, there's just not a way to keep that. So on the positive side, what that actually meant is it would have been hard to create new packages. Even if I have been successful in keeping the old name, I wouldn't have been able to spin up anything new. And starting in 6.0, there was a considerable amount of refactoring to break out some more common abstractions between people who were still working on the older, Web API stack versus ASP.NET Core. And so there were a lot of advantages there. Also be able to now have a client library, like, hey, if you need to spin up a HTTP client, how do you make it easy for that guy to ask for the right version and find all that information? So on the positive side, a bunch of great refactoring and additional things got to happen by changing the packages. But the biggest problem is really trying to get that out there so that people know that it actually happened. And that was really like the biggest disaster. I had no control over the packages in any way for close to 2 years. And so there was just no way to really tell people like, hey, this thing. And I tried to warn people because, if you just go to NuGet, once you're already onboarded after so many years, I think at that time we had, 150 million downloads. No one's going to notice that, like, oh yeah, by the way, the package name changed and you should go to this new ID. No one's going to figure that out.
It's a weird and unfortunate situation, right? I think even when .NET 6 came out, right? So the versioning package was still on 5.x. I think then we discussed this on GitHub. I still remember, and I also was surprised that you were not part of the Web API team, right? Because it sounded so logical to me, right, that it needs to come out of the team, right? But I mean, I'm just happy if something works. So I'm happy that the project is in good hands, right? And I know which project I need to take, right? But that's one of the reasons why we're doing the podcast right now, because that's vital information, and you can't use .NET 8 soon, right? And have the NuGet package for versioning 5.x. But that's just one challenge,
absolutely.
Right?
I mean, the start of it all was me actually trying to solve my own problems, right? And I kind of ran the project internally for close to 2 years. So this was probably close to 8-9 years ago. And when it felt like it was stable enough, that's when I kind of took it to the outside. But yeah, even coming up with a new name, like, what am I going to call it now? So I kind of did a little play on the words, right? It's ASP version, but also just ASP, as in like the snake. So a little trickery there, because I'm like, I don't know what else to call it, and still also kind of make it quasi discoverable for people. So I did say though that this week I did finally mark all the old Microsoft packages as deprecated with all the migration information. So hopefully that's going to also help some people do that transition. Because yeah, you're right. There were a lot of people who were moving on to 6, 7, and beyond that were still trying to use the old 5x versions. And some people don't realize that the target framework that libraries are built for really have an affinity to the ones that you should actually use. So for example, if you're running on .NET 6, you should be running like the libraries for ASP.NET Core 6, which the 5.0 libraries don't technically support. No, it probably works, and for most people it did, because otherwise I'd get tons of.
You could even use 7, right? But yeah, it's unfortunate that it's still possible, and so confusing if you don't know why, right? But I think that's a whole different discussion, right?
And there are some edge cases, though. I unfortunately I have found some edge cases where if you don't do that, like, things break. Like, for example, some of them resulted in the dreaded like missing method exception. I've had that happen before. Or the other one that happened is once they introduced default interface implementations. I actually don't know why, but the ASP.NET Core team added a method to an interface, and if you actually happen to call through that interface, it actually threw not supported exception. And there kind of was like not a way to avoid going through that path. I'm like, So basically, if you take those older versions and you get pushed forward, bad things could actually happen. So I've always made sure that I coordinate releases that always correspond to the target TFM that's going to be released. So we're getting close to, we got about a month left.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think wasn't there even an issue? I think .NET 6 came out, and we had the .NET 5 version of the library, and then I think if you had two versions in, I believe the same, was it the same controller class or the same controller class file? I don't remember. Then the Swagger generation didn't work. It's really weird, right? Because of some internal changes. But of course, you couldn't, as you just described, not update your implementation to the changed inner workings of the new stack, right? So yeah, so happy to see it back. Yeah,
Yeah, some people were even confused and thought they needed both, and that just really messed things up. I saw that happen a few times. So, but yeah, I think mostly now people have kind of largely figured it out. The numbers are still pretty high for downloads on the older ones. We've only got about a week since the official deprecation message has been out there, so hopefully we'll see an uptick in the newer libraries now.
okay. Yeah, I mean it works great, right? I've been using it in several projects with great success, and I mean it's things like versioning. Of course, you can kind of implement them on your own with layman approach, something like that, creative routing or whatever. But then on the other hand, content negotiation, for instance, is hard, right? If you want to do it properly, right? So stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for the most part, it's kind of interesting. If you actually want to do it by media type negotiation, it's surprisingly not too terribly difficult to do. So it's in the world of ASP.NET, for example, so the matching doesn't actually care about media type parameters. So, when you're versioning, if you add like, let's say a V or a version, whatever you want to call it, that actually has nothing to do with how it maps things. And this was traditionally kind of the painful part of doing true custom media types, because then you'd have to register like your own media type formatter for every single version that you wanted to do. And that was pretty painful in your app config to map all those. If you do it as a parameter, you actually don't have to, which is the default, what API versioning does by default. You don't actually have to reconfigure anything. And so it's just like it comes in, it says, "Oh, hey, I want JSON." There you go, and it matches.
So when's the right time to make new versions? Is it only when the inputs change or for a given output, or when should somebody make a new version versus just change the code behind an existing version?
Great question. So I think just the blanket rule is any visible change over the wire, you're talking about a new version. So if you make a change to your contract, that's a fairly obvious one. In any way, adding or subtracting. The trickier one is probably behavior, right? So behavioral changes, depends on the behavior, probably should probably also be versioned. Now, things like changing standard headers and things like that, in the context of REST, I don't actually think that probably needs a new version, right? If you start omitting extra headers or so forth, as long as they're not custom headers, they're standard headers, I wouldn't call that a change. It's not a change in your API contract. I think that's what some people misunderstand is, as the uniform interface constraint, HTTP is the API, right? So you should think of it as like HTTP is the class, .get is the method, .put is the method. The thing that you're actually defining is how is that actually realized, and you're passing, a message in between, right? Because HTTP is basically message based, right? You request message in, response message out. But you're actually, but people want to think of it like they're calling, the do work method on their class. That's not really how an HTTP API works.
That definitely reminds me of SOAP. Thinking about it as an object and just a method on that object that you call and process it that way. So what haven't we covered that we should know about, Chris?
Probably the Swagger Open API stuff was a pretty interesting one. So there's a ton of API versioning certainly covers a lot of that. Now, I guess probably the misnomer is I added that support not to specifically support Open API and Swagger. It's really about how do you explore your API. One of those use cases is API documentation. You could also imagine like if you wanted to have an automated test suite and you want to enumerate all the versions you have and sort of like, kick off, how do you interrogate your whole API and figure out how do I collate all this stuff together? So there's a lot of different scenarios that you actually might need to do that with. But yeah, being able to support that with like Open API and Swagger was definitely a pretty big one. And I haven't seen really any other options actually do that. Pretty much every other implementation that I've seen do it is essentially like hard coding their versions in there, or maybe they have it configured somewhere that they enumerate over, but it's essentially not derived from the code. So that was an important thing to make that part of API versioning. So that would be there. I guess one of the other newer things is adding more support for client side and for policies. So I don't think there's been a lot of following of that yet, but starting in 6.0, we added a little bit more about how you can advertise your policies. So for example, if you want to advertise like, hey, a client combining these two things. Let's say a client comes in and says like, well, I asked for API 1 and let's say it's on a path to be deprecated. How does a client ever going to find that out? So first you have to be able to tell the client to do that. And so for a long time, since the beginning, there's always been headers to tell you, these are the versions that are supported and these are the ones that are deprecated. Deprecated just means it's still there, but it's on a path to go away. So part of the big problem with that was like, how do you know when that's actually going to happen? And it turns out there was an RFC recently, a couple of years ago, called, it's around sunset, basically the sunset header. And starting in 6.0, there's now a capability to define a sunset policy. And so what the sunset policy will actually tell you is when you ask for a specific version, you will also, if you're advertising the information as the service, that will also emit sunset policy information to the client. So let's say if you're on 1.0 and there's a policy defined for it, it'll come back with a sunset header. It will tell you when that API is going to be permanently shut down. In conjunction with that, there's another RFC around web linking. This is one of the possible ways you could do Hatios that I've become a big fan of, which you can advertise link headers, very much how you could put like an anchor tag in HTML. And the advantage of that is then you can put, they can have targets, sort of like how a style sheet says like, hey, you can have relevance of like what this is actually for. So you can have relevance to say like, actually so here's when it's going to sunset. And oh, by the way, there's a link here that will tell you to go to this HTML page that will give you our actual stated policy, because you can't possibly put that all like in a response. And that might actually say, hey, we support, N-2, the version you asked for is actually going to be sunset in 6 months, whatever that policy is. It could also include language, right? So if you have something that's like maybe in different languages and so forth, you might support more than just English. On the client side of that, there's now some client extensions then that says like, hey, when you create a new HTTP client, let's say through a factory, you can configure what version you want your factory to create. So if you're on version 2, rather than have your code necessarily know that, hey, I'm always going to I have to append, version 2 to the correct query string or whatever the location is, you could just set that up in your factory. You just ask for the HTTP client and it will always amend the version wherever it's supposed to go based on the service and automatically for every request. In a similar fashion, then that can also now hook up into logging with that same information that might be advertised from the service. So now you can imagine combining these two things. As a client, how do you know that something should actually happen? So let's say you're on 1.0. 1.0 has now been deprecated by the service. If you're going through this client extension, it will actually detect, oh, hey, I see there was a sunset policy that tells me this is deprecated and it's going to go away in 6 months. And it will call into whatever you define for your logging infrastructure. And that might actually then turn into some type of alarm for you to be like, oh, hey, by the way, this thing's going to go away in 6 months. You need to go migrate. And additionally, here's the link that describes the policy for that. In a similar way, how does a client know when a new version is going to be available? Unless you're constantly checking it as the client, you might not know when that happens. So in a similar way, it also hooks in and says, oh yeah, hey, you asked for version 1, but by the way, there's now a version 2. 1 will still support it, but there's a version 2 that you might want to look at. So those are a couple of new things that I don't think have probably been as well discussed or advertised for features.
That's great. Yeah. My next question was going to be, how do we gracefully deprecate our APIs to the people know, hey, this is going away. And so you answered that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I have not, that really is not in the feature set, it probably will come sometime post 8.0. I need to look at it some more, is I've always had the basic concept of what we call advertising versions. So you have supported versions, which are versions you implemented. You have deprecated versions, which are ones that you implemented, but they're going to go away. And then there's the idea of advertising a version. So advertising in a version is this advanced concept of saying like, well, hey, I know that this version exists, but it's not here. Like, so imagine that you split your application apart. Like, one application is fully V1, some other application is fully V2. How do you advertise that information? So there's no way, there's no code connection where you can just kind of go interrogate that. So that expressing that metadata has always been possible. Now we have things like YARP where you can have sort of the reverse proxy. So I've been looking at some ways of like, is there a way we can take advantage of that? And if you end up going through like a reverse proxy, advertise that information and actually figure out then, hey, which endpoint do you need to be redirected to? So it's pretty involved, but that's one that I think it'll be pretty interesting and useful for people that are versioning through like gateways or things where they got to have multiple endpoints, like isolated endpoints.
So we're going to have LTS API versions and non-LTS and
standard support.
Right.
I think that was great. And I think it's about time. Yep. We should move ourselves on to picks. So, Christian, why don't you go first? What's your pick this week?
Since I was away, I have a streaming pick this time for a change. And maybe this has already been a streaming pick before I came on board, right? So apologies for that. But there was this one show which I never wanted to watch, and now I started while they were in their 3rd season, and I was binge watching all 3 seasons. And that show, of course, is Only Murders in the Building. I think in the US it runs on Hulu. Where I live, it ran on Disney Plus, and it's with Steve Martin in the lead and Martin Short. And I mean, they're both famous and great, but especially if you see them together, and I think they're also touring together from time to time, and when they're on late night shows, they have this kind of intentional obnoxious vibe, right? So I was always very reluctant to watch that show. And the 3rd star of the show is Selena Gomez, which I also didn't. I mean, I don't fancy her a lot, but together they have an incredible chemistry because Steve Martin is Steve Martin. Martin Short is Martin Short. They have of course different roles, but I mean they have again this obnoxious vibe, but she keeps them in check. That's really amazing. They have a great chemistry with each other, and I don't want to give away too much, but as the name of the show already suggests, they all live in a building. It's a large apartment building in New York, and there are murders, at least one per season, and they are finding out who did it. And it's really nicely done. Episodes are relatively short, 30, 35 minutes, so easy to digest. Very well written, funny. So it's not a murder mystery thriller, it's like a murder mystery comedy, I would say. And yeah, I was watching it almost back to back, and there will be a season 4 next year. So already looking forward to that. So that's my pick for this episode.
Chris, do you have something to let our listeners know about?
Oh, for a pick. Gosh, there's so many things that are missed now, from the writer strike. I've been like clamoring for something new. I'm kind of sad that Ahsoka was over. I absolutely loved it. I think there were some mixed reactions. I was a big fan of all the anime, so I was all caught up with a lot of the backstory. But I you know what? I really, really appreciate what Dave Filoni actually does. I'm almost ready to go watch it again because I thought okay, why did they do that? And what did this mean? And then, I've been reading some things going, oh yeah, I see the nuance of that. I totally missed. I totally missed that. I need to go back and like watch it again and catch that little detail that maybe I didn't interpret the way I thought I interpreted it the first time around. So that was a real pleasure. But yeah, I've been rewatching a lot right now.
So then your pick is the Ahsoka series on Disney Plus.
I thought it was great, and if you hadn't watched all the anime behind it, yeah, the Clone Wars and if you go power through it, yeah, the Clone Wars and the Rebels anime was I think something extra. It's meant for kids, but there's a lot of adult nuance in there that you can see. If you know what you're looking for, you see right through it.
So my pick this week is we're about 11 days from Halloween. So last year for Halloween, I bought this little animated pumpkin that sings and tells jokes and things like that. And it's kind of made out of plastic, but it's kind of a translucent type plastic, and it's got a little projector inside of it. So it projects, this animated face on the front of the pumpkin, and it's got a speaker and things like that to, talk to the kids and things as they're coming up, or it's singing a song, and the kids can, just be amused by this little talking pumpkin. And I was just looking at their website, and they've now made new versions. They have a bigger version, but then they also have a giant blow up version that you can put out in the yard. You can do something like that. Or they've also got like a cat or a reindeer or a snowman man type of thing. So, uh, yeah, this is a company called Mindscope Products, and the one that I bought is called Jabber and Jack. But I'll put the link in the show notes to all their different products that they have out there, and yeah, it's pretty cute.
Oh, actually,
So
I have a favor to ask either from you, Sean, or from our listeners. I was in a shop 1 year ago, also close to Halloween, because we are recording this close to Halloween, as Sean mentioned. And there I saw something similar, but it was a skull, and it kind of started, speaking and being illuminated when you were passing by. So there was a motion detector, but it was not to entertain kids, but rather to frighten people, young and old. But I never found this again. So I didn't buy it last year in the shop. I went to the shop actually last week, but they didn't have it in stock. So if anyone knows what that could have been or has a source for this kind of thing, please do let me know. I need it for at least for Halloween 2024.
yeah, I Halloween is like my favorite holiday because it's so interactive with the costumes and haunted houses and things like that. So I always really enjoy Halloween. I've dressed up as the Stave Puff Marshmallow Man once, and some friends of mine have a really popular haunted house. And so what I did is I stood out by the gate where people come in, like I was just like this yard ornament, like a blow up thing that's in the yard. Let them go by, go through the haunted house, and then on their way back out, then I just step out right in front of them and get them. So because they thought I was just this inflatable thing, but nope, I'm more than inflatable. All right, Chris, thanks for coming on the show. If our listeners have questions, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Certainly around the project, yeah. Just going out to the repo, we can drop that in the chat. Issues, discussions, they're both wide open. I'd say probably 75% of everybody who comes to the repo is asking questions. So start a discussion, ask a question, request features. How do you do something? That's probably been the best. The best thing about building out the community and getting a lot of feedback is, I don't give you one line responses. People are like, how do I do this? And you get like 3 paragraphs. And they're like, wow. So,
Cool.
And I can confirm that's true. Seriously. So, by all means, he's not lying, not at all.
So, well, I mean, if I want you to use, I gotta nudge you somehow. So,
exactly.
Okay.
All right. That's been a great show. Thank you so much, Chris, for coming.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
If our listeners want to reach out in touch with the show, they can get me. I am on X, I'm on Threads, and I'm on Tribal, all under the name .NET Superhero. Thanks, everybody. And we'll catch you all on the next episode of Adventures in .NET.